Calvin Washington was 44 years old, and until the day he buried his mother, he thought the worst thing Rena had ever done to him was take the house. He was a structural engineer, steady, quiet, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked. His ex-wife had taken the house, the savings, and 3 years of alimony when she left, and he had rebuilt, slowly, without complaint. So when Rena walked into his mother's funeral with another man, dressed like it was a dinner party, sitting in the front row like she still belonged somewhere in his life, Calvin didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched. What neither of them knew was that Dorothy Washington, a woman who had spent 40 years cleaning other people's homes and clipping coupons, had left behind a $2.3 million estate, and the will was about to be read in the next room. Calvin knew something they didn't, and he had been waiting a long time to let them find out. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Calvin's apartment wasn't much, but it was clean and organized, a reflection of how he'd rebuilt his life after Rena took almost everything. The evening light filtered through vertical blinds, casting long shadows across the beige carpet as he sat at his small dining table, phone in hand. Patricia perched on his worn leather couch, her usual energy subdued by grief. She'd arrived 20 minutes after he called with the news about their mother. "The funeral home needs an answer about the viewing hours," Calvin said, his voice steady, despite the hollow feeling in his chest. He glanced at his notepad where he'd been tracking details. "I'm thinking Thursday evening and Friday morning before the service." "That works," Patricia nodded. "Mama would want it simple. No fuss." Calvin made another note. The funeral home director had been patient, understanding that Calvin needed to work through each decision methodically. It was how he handled everything, careful consideration, then decisive action. "Have you heard from anyone else in the family?" he asked Patricia. "Most of the cousins. Aunt Marie's driving down from Charlotte." Patricia hesitated. "And Rena called me." Calvin's pen paused mid-word. "Called you?" "Yeah. Not you. Me. Said she was so sorry to hear about Dorothy and wanted to know about arrangements." Patricia's tone carried a note of suspicion. "Felt strange, her reaching out to me instead of you. Everything about Rena was calculated," Calvin said quietly. He remembered how she'd strategically built relationships with his family during their marriage, positioning herself as the devoted daughter-in-law while simultaneously pushing him to spend beyond their means. The 9 years they'd been married played through his mind like a PowerPoint presentation, each slide revealing another financial drain. The house they couldn't afford, the car leases she insisted on, the vacations charged to credit cards. He'd taken extra engineering consulting work, stretching himself thin while she spent. "Remember how she used to talk about investing in their lifestyle?" Patricia asked, shaking her head. "Right up until she invested in Derek Ashford instead," Calvin replied. The words held no bitterness, just fact. He'd discovered the affair 18 months before the divorce was final. Emails, hotel receipts, a pattern of business dinners that weren't business at all. But Calvin had said nothing, simply documented everything. When divorce proceedings began, he used that leverage during settlement negotiations, not for revenge, but to limit further damage. Still, Rena and her attorney had engineered maximum extraction. The house, liquid assets, 3 years of alimony that had finally ended 2 months ago. Calvin had rebuilt from there, turning his engineering expertise to side projects that slowly replenished his savings. "I need to iron my suit for Friday," he said, standing. His mother had taught him to always look presentable, regardless of circumstances. In his bedroom, he removed his dark suit from the closet. As he shook out the jacket, something fluttered to the floor. A folded piece of paper. His mother's distinctive handwriting covered one side. "Calvin, baby. When the time comes, don't let anybody rush you. Sit still." Everything I've done is in the black binder. I love you, Mama. The note was dated 8 months ago. Calvin read it twice, then set it carefully on his dresser. He didn't know what black binder she meant, but something in his chest tightened at the deliberate tone of her words. He plugged in the iron, waiting for it to heat. Through the bedroom door, he could hear Patricia on the phone, coordinating with more relatives. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, her constant reminder that patience was power, that sitting still in crucial moments revealed what rushing would miss. Calvin smoothed his hand over the suit jacket, remembering how she'd taught him to press the sleeves just so, to always mind the details. Dorothy Washington had raised him to handle things properly, to maintain dignity even when others didn't. He picked up the iron, focusing on each careful stroke, letting the familiar motion calm his thoughts. The night settled around him as he worked, the apartment quiet except for the soft hiss of steam and Patricia's muted conversation. His mother was gone, but her lessons remained, about patience, about dignity, about waiting for the right moment. He didn't know what was in the black binder she'd mentioned, but he knew he would find out exactly when he was meant to. New Covenant Baptist Church stood solid against the morning sky, its red brick walls holding 41 years of Dorothy Washington's faithfulness. Calvin arrived 2 hours early with Patricia and Troy, watching the deacons set up chairs in the fellowship hall for the repast. "You want me to check the programs again?" Troy asked, his protective instincts already showing. He'd been like that since they were kids, always positioning himself between Calvin and potential trouble. "They're fine," Calvin said. He'd reviewed them himself last night, making sure every detail was correct. The church's gold-embossed logo topped each page, with service details and, at Dorothy's specific request, her estate attorney's contact information printed at the bottom. The sanctuary filled steadily as morning light streamed through stained glass. Mrs. Jenkins from 3 houses down brought her famous potato salad for later. Mr. Wilson, who'd employed Dorothy as a housekeeper for 15 years, arrived with his wife and adult children. Then came Sarah Martinez, now a registered nurse at Grady Memorial, whom Dorothy had helped through nursing school with quiet encouragement and carefully timed grocery gift cards. "Your mama changed my life," Sarah told Calvin, her eyes wet. "I was ready to quit school, working 2 jobs, barely making it. She just showed up one day with groceries and said, 'Baby, you keep studying.' Did that every month until I graduated." Calvin nodded, adding another piece to the puzzle of who his mother had really been. The sanctuary continued filling. More neighbors, church members, lives Dorothy had touched without fanfare. 20 minutes before the service was set to begin, a familiar click of heels drew his attention. Raina entered through the main doors, Derek Ashford at her side. She wore a fitted black dress that spoke more of fashion than mourning, accented with pearl earrings Calvin remembered buying her for their 5th anniversary. Derek sported a crisp charcoal suit with a pocket square. Troy tensed beside Calvin as the pair made their way down the center aisle, settling into the second pew, the section reserved for family. Raina arranged herself gracefully, while Derek's eyes swept the sanctuary with the calculating gaze of a man assessing property value. Calvin felt Troy's anger building and touched his cousin's arm lightly. A small shake of his head was all it took. Troy understood, though his jaw remained tight. The service itself was beautiful in its simplicity. Pastor Richardson spoke about Dorothy's quiet strength, her unwavering faith, her service to others. Then Sister Margaret from the women's ministry stepped up to share something that made Calvin's chest tighten. "Many of you didn't know," she began, "but for the past 12 years, Dorothy Washington has been the anonymous donor behind our Young Women's College Fund. Every semester, she provided scholarships for 2 young sisters to pursue their education. She never wanted recognition. She just wanted them to have their chance." Calvin sat very still, absorbing this new information about his mother. He'd known she was generous, but this spoke of planning, of resources he hadn't imagined she had. At the repast, people filled plates and shared memories. Calvin was speaking with Mr. Wilson when Rena approached, her expression a masterpiece of practiced sympathy. She touched his arm with familiar presumption. "Calvin, I'm so sorry about Dorothy. She was always so special." The pause was subtle but deliberate. Behind her, Derek stepped forward, hand extended. "Sorry for your loss, brother," Derek said, his tone carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never faced real consequence. His handshake was firm, a businessman's handshake, meant to convey authority. "Thank you for coming," Calvin replied simply, his voice neutral. He watched them move through the crowd, noting how Raina touched people's arms, leaned in close, played her role of grieving former daughter-in-law. Troy appeared at his elbow, speaking low. Derek just photographed the program. Got real interested in that attorney information at the bottom. Sent some texts right after. Calvin observed Derek's casual stance by the punch bowl, phone still in hand. "I see him." Troy's muscles bunched under his suit jacket. "Want me to—" "Not yet." Calvin's voice was quiet, but firm. His mother's note about sitting still echoed in his mind. There would be time for movement later. Right now, observation was enough. The funeral home's private family room felt smaller than its actual dimensions, with dark wood paneling and tasteful beige chairs arranged in a semicircle. Harold Osey, Dorothy's estate attorney for 22 years, stood by a polished conference table, arranging documents with methodical precision. His silver-rimmed glasses caught the afternoon light as he checked his watch, right on schedule. People filed in quietly. Patricia sat closest to the table, hands folded in her lap. Troy positioned himself near the door, his broad shoulders filling the frame as Raina and Derek approached from the hallway. "Family only," Troy said, his voice low but firm. Derek opened his mouth to object, but Raina touched his arm, a practiced gesture of restraint. She'd perfected that move during her marriage to Calvin, always positioning herself as the voice of reason. "I was Dorothy's daughter-in-law for 9 years, she said softly. "I should be here." Troy looked to Calvin, who sat perfectly still in his chair. "Let them in," Calvin said, his tone carrying neither welcome nor hostility, just certainty. Patricia shot him a questioning look. Calvin met her eyes briefly, communicating the same message he'd given Troy at the church. "Wait." Harold cleared his throat once everyone was seated. "Per Mrs. Washington's explicit written instructions, this reading is to take place immediately following the service." He adjusted his glasses. "Dorothy established a trust 11 years ago, which holds the majority of her assets. I'll begin with a summary." The room settled into expectant silence. Derek had his phone face down on his knee. Raina sat with perfect posture, her expression composed but alert. "The trust contains the following assets," Harold continued, his voice carrying the same measured tone he'd likely used in thousands of readings before. "Index fund investments totaling approximately $1.1 million, accumulated over 30 years of consistent contributions." A small sound escaped Raina's throat. Calvin didn't look at her. "A fully paid commercial property in Macon, Georgia, currently generating $6,400 in monthly rental income, $440,000 in a money market account, $180,000 in Series The Mines savings bonds." Derek's hand twitched toward his phone. Troy shifted slightly, drawing Derek's attention and stilling his movement. "Additionally," Harold continued, "there is a life insurance policy with a payout of $250,000, plus personal property and a vehicle. The total estate value is approximately $2.3 million. The silence in the room became tangible. Calvin could hear the tick of Harold's watch, the soft whisper of paper as he turned to the next page, the controlled breathing of everyone present trying to process what they'd just heard. Rena's carefully maintained expression cracked just slightly. A microscopic widening of the eyes, a barely perceptible tension around her mouth. Derek's posture had changed entirely, his spine straightening as calculations visibly ran behind his eyes. "Regarding distribution," Harold said, "the commercial property in Macon transfers to Calvin Jerome Washington outright. The investment accounts are to be divided 60% to Calvin Jerome Washington and 40% to Patricia Washington Mills, with Patricia's portion partially held in trust for her children's education." Patricia pressed her hands to her mouth, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "The life insurance names Calvin Jerome Washington as sole beneficiary. $50,000 is bequeathed to New Covenant Baptist Church's scholarship fund. There are additional small bequests to 2 longtime friends, which will be handled separately." Harold gathered his papers with deliberate movements. Dorothy was very precise in her wishes. "She asked me to read one final note aloud." He lifted a single sheet of paper, Dorothy's familiar handwriting visible even from where Calvin sat. "I worked in other people's houses my whole life, and watched how they moved money. I just did the same thing. Quiet. Nobody needs to know what you have. Let them think what they want. Calvin, you know what to do." Rena stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Derek's hand moved toward his phone. "Nobody's rushing anywhere," Calvin said pleasantly, his voice filling the room. He turned his head slowly, meeting Derek's eyes directly. "Sit down." The authority in those 2 words seemed to surprise Derek as much as anyone. He sat, his phone remaining untouched on his knee. Harold began organizing folders into his briefcase. "Mr. Washington, shall we schedule our follow-up meeting for Monday morning?" 9 o'clock works for me," Calvin replied, standing to shake Harold's hand. The attorney's grip was firm, professional, the handshake of a man who had executed his duties exactly as instructed. Later that night, Calvin drove home alone, streetlights casting intermittent shadows across his dashboard. His mother's note from the suit pocket lay on the passenger seat, her handwriting a testament to patience he was only beginning to understand. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dorothy Washington's driveway as Calvin pulled up in his Honda Civic. The modest single-story house sat quiet, unchanged from the outside, white paint still fresh from last year's touch-up, flower beds still tidy from his mother's final gardening weekend, but it felt different now. It was his house, legally and completely. Calvin sat in the car for a moment, key in hand. Through the windshield, he could see the kitchen window where his mother had been standing when she had her stroke, making evening tea. The paramedics said it had been quick, merciful, no prolonged suffering, just the teacup shattering on the linoleum, and then silence. He walked up the familiar concrete path, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. The house smelled of lemon furniture polish and the lingering trace of his mother's favorite vanilla air freshener. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Dishes dried in the rack, reading glasses folded on the coffee table, TV guide open to last Tuesday's programs. Calvin moved through the living room, past family photos spanning decades. Him and Patricia as children, his high school graduation, the wedding photo with Raina that his mother had never taken down, even after the divorce. Dorothy Washington had been deliberate in everything, including what she chose to display. The master bedroom door creaked softly as he pushed it open. Sunlight filtered through cream-colored curtains, illuminating the carefully made bed with its quilted cover. The closet stood partially open, winter coats pushed to one side despite the Georgia summer heat. Calvin reached past the heavy wool coats, feeling along the back wall of the closet. His hand brushed something solid, a 3-ring binder, thick with documents. He pulled it out, recognizing his mother's handwriting on the spine. Records. Important. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Calvin opened the binder. The organization was meticulous, with labeled dividers and clear page protectors. The first section contained bank statements, not Dorothy's, but Raina's. Somehow his mother had obtained copies, tracking unusual spending patterns and noting dates in her precise handwriting. The next section held handwritten accounts of conversations, each dated and detailed. October 15th, 2018. Raina asked again about the house deed. Said she was just curious about property values in Macon. February 3rd, 2019. Another conversation about wills. Third time this year she's brought it up. Calvin's hands were steady as he turned the pages, but his chest felt tight. Each entry revealed a pattern he hadn't seen while living it. His ex-wife systematically probing for information about assets, looking for inheritance potential, building a long-term strategy. Then he found the email printout. Dorothy had learned to take screenshots. Patricia must have helped her with that. The message was from Raina to a friend, dated 3 years into their marriage. His mama has nothing. This was a miscalculation, but I can still work with what he earns. But it was the final section that made Calvin close his eyes briefly. Meeting notes, parking receipts, restaurant bills. A paper trail showing Raina had been meeting Derek Ashford for 2 full years before filing for divorce. Not after, as Calvin had believed. Not a relationship that developed post-separation. A calculated exit strategy, running parallel to their marriage. Calvin sat in his mother's kitchen, the binder open on the table where she'd had her last cup of tea. The morning light caught the dust motes floating in the air. He could almost hear her voice. "Sit still. Everything I have done is in the black binder." He pulled out his phone and called Harold Osei. The attorney answered on the second ring. "Mr. Osei, I need to understand every legal protection around the trust, specifically regarding former spouse claims under Georgia law." Harold's voice was calm, certain. "The assets are clean, Mr. Washington. Titled correctly, properly documented, protected from any potential claims. Your mother was very thorough about this point in particular. Thank you." Calvin ended the call and immediately dialed Troy. "I need you to pull everything public record on Derek Ashford's properties," he said when Troy answered. "Every LLC, every filing, everything in Fulton and DeKalb counties." "What am I looking for?" Troy asked. "I don't know yet," Calvin replied. "But a man who photographs estate attorney contact information at a funeral is looking for a door. I want to know what door he thinks he's found." Calvin gathered the binder and walked out to his car, placing it securely in the trunk and engaging the lock. He stood in the driveway one last time, looking at his mother's kitchen window, remembering her standing there making tea. Tomorrow morning he would meet Troy and begin piecing together whatever Derek Ashford was planning. But for now, he simply stood still, honoring the patience that had built this moment. The Silver Skillet Diner hummed with early morning activity as Calvin slid into the booth across from Troy. Coffee cups and scattered papers already covered most of the table. Troy had been here a while, methodically piecing together public records on Derek Ashford's business dealings. "You want the bad news first or the worse news?" Troy asked, pushing a cup of black coffee toward Calvin. Calvin wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "Give me all of it." Troy pulled out 3 property documents and laid them side by side. "These are all owned by Ashford Development, LLC. Look at the investor disclosure forms." Calvin leaned forward, scanning the documents. There it was in black and white. Raina Washington listed as a co-investor on 3 separate properties. "She put in almost $90,000, Troy continued, tapping the papers with his pen. "Based on the timing, that's got to be from the divorce settlement, which means she invested my money in Derek's projects," Calvin finished quietly. He sat back, letting that sink in. The alimony payments he'd struggled to make for 3 years hadn't gone toward Raina's fresh start. They'd gone straight into Derek's business ventures. "That's the bad news," Troy said. "The worst news is what I found in Macon." He pulled out another set of documents, these bearing the City of Macon letterhead. Ashford Development submitted a preliminary proposal 6 weeks ago for a major redevelopment project. The target property shares a block with Dorothy's building. Calvin studied the proposal drawings. The planned development would encompass the entire block. Retail spaces, office suites, parking structure. But the layout made one thing clear. The project wasn't viable without Dorothy's property. He wasn't there for Raina, Calvin said softly. He was at the funeral for the property. Man's got nerve, I'll give him that. Troy gathered the papers into a neat stack. What's your play? Calvin pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number Dorothy had saved in his contacts months ago. Beverly Trout, commercial attorney. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice answered. Beverly Trout's office. Ms. Trout, this is Calvin Washington, Dorothy Washington's son. Mr. Washington, I've been expecting your call. Her voice carried the direct efficiency of someone who didn't waste words. I assume you're calling about the Ashford Development situation? What can you tell me? Their representative approached the neighboring property owners 6 weeks ago about a joint development opportunity. Your mother told me last year someone was sniffing around her property. She made it very clear she wasn't selling to anyone, and that if anything happened to her before she could handle it herself, you would take care of it. Calvin thought of the black binder, of his mother's patient documentation. She was right. He was about to ask Beverly about zoning regulations when his phone buzzed with another call. Raina's name appeared on the screen. I need to take this, he told Beverly. Can I call you back in 30 minutes? Of course. Calvin switched lines. Hello, Raina. Calvin. Her voice was warm, careful, the tone she used when she wanted something. I've been thinking about you, about how overwhelming all this must be. The property, the responsibilities. I'm managing. Of course you are. A delicate pause. It's just, Derek mentioned he might have some ideas about the Macon property, ways to make things easier for you. Commercial real estate can be so complicated to manage on your own. Calvin watched a waitress refill Troy's coffee cup. What kind of ideas? Maybe we could all meet, talk through some options. Derek has experience with these situations. He really wants to help. I'll think about it, Calvin said evenly. Just think about it. That's all I'm asking. Another careful pause. Take care of yourself, Calvin. The line went dead. Calvin immediately dialed Beverly Trout back. Ms. Trout, I want to file a formal zoning objection to Ashford Development's proposal. As an adjacent property owner, I understand I have standing. You do, Beverly confirmed. I can have the paperwork ready within a week. But are you sure you want to take this step? It will effectively freeze their entire project. Yes, Calvin said, looking at the scattered documents showing how thoroughly Derek and Raina had underestimated him. I'm sure. Troy was watching him with a slight smile. They really don't know what they're dealing with, do they? Calvin took a slow sip of his coffee. No, he said quietly. They don't. The Macon courthouse steps gleamed in the morning sun as Calvin climbed them alongside Beverly Trout. Her heels clicked purposefully against the stone, matching her precise demeanor. Inside her briefcase was the zoning objection they'd spent the past week perfecting. The paperwork is comprehensive, Beverly said, as they cleared security. As an adjacent property owner, you have clear standing to challenge their proposed variances. Once filed, this stops their entire timeline cold. Calvin nodded, thinking of Derek's careful positioning at the funeral, his staged sympathy, his quick phone work after photographing the program. How long will the freeze last? Minimum 6 months before they can even request a hearing. Then there's the public review process. Beverly's lips curved slightly. Your mother mentioned you were an engineer. The technical portions of your objection are particularly thorough. They reached the clerk's office where Beverly efficiently processed the filing. Calvin watched her stamp each page with practiced precision, thinking of his mother's own methodical documentation. When Beverly handed him the receipt, he felt a familiar certainty. the kind that came from careful preparation, meeting the right moment. From there, they drove to Harold's satellite office in Macon for the second phase of the morning's work. Harold was waiting with fresh lease documents and property assessment forms spread across his conference table. "The current tenants are stable," Harold said, reviewing the files. "All local businesses, good payment history. Your mother chose them carefully." Calvin spent the next 2 hours signing updated leases and reviewing improvement proposals Beverly had prepared. New energy-efficient windows for the main retail space, updated security lighting for the parking area, small, strategic upgrades that would immediately increase the property's assessed value. These improvements demonstrate clear intent to maintain and enhance the property, Beverly noted. It creates a paper trail of active management, not passive holding. "I'm not selling," Calvin said quietly. "I'm building." Harold nodded with subtle approval, just as Dorothy would have wanted. Back in Atlanta that afternoon, Calvin made 2 careful phone calls. The first was to Angela, one of Raina's closest friends who had hosted their engagement party years ago. The second was to Michelle, who had been Raina's confidant during the marriage's final years. Both conversations were warm, casual, just checking in, sharing memories of Dorothy, catching up on life. But in those natural exchanges, both women revealed what Raina had been saying about the funeral. How she had been there for Calvin in his grief. How Derek had really stepped up when Calvin was struggling to handle everything. The narrative was being carefully constructed. Raina as the supportive ex-wife, Derek as the generous businessman trying to help. Calvin absorbed this information without reaction, adding it to his mental catalog alongside the black binder's content. He was learning that Raina's greatest skill had always been story crafting, building sympathetic narratives that positioned her exactly where she needed to be. His phone buzzed with a text from Harold late that afternoon. Derek Ashford's attorney sent formal inquiry re. Property acquisition, partnership. Responding per your instruction. Calvin pictured Harold's carefully worded reply. Mr. Washington is open to a conversation. He prefers to meet in person. The response came less than 2 hours later. Derek's team wanted to meet next week. They would bring full proposal documents. They looked forward to exploring mutually beneficial opportunities. Driving home that evening, Calvin called Troy. "He took it," Calvin said when Troy answered. "Meeting next week." "Man's desperate," Troy replied. "That objection you filed hit him where it hurts. How you want to play this?" "Exactly like Mama would," Calvin said, thinking of Dorothy's patient accumulation of leverage, her quiet observation of weaknesses, her perfect timing. "Sit still. Let him talk. Then explain exactly how this is going to go. You need me there?" "No," Calvin said, watching Atlanta's skyline emerge through his windshield. "I need you ready for what happens after." The October afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Dorothy's Macon commercial property as Derek's black Mercedes pulled in alongside Calvin's modest sedan. Calvin and Beverly Trout stood waiting by the main entrance, watching Derek and his attorney step out with leather portfolios and practiced confidence. "Mr. Washington," Derek called out, his voice carrying that same easy tone from the funeral. "Good to see you again." He gestured to the man beside him. "This is James Morton, from Caldwell and Rice. Hope you don't mind us bringing some paperwork to make things official." Calvin nodded once, noting how Derek's suit probably cost more than 3 months of his mother's Social Security check. "Beverly Trout," he said, introducing his attorney. "She's handled this property's affairs for years." They settled into the small conference room Dorothy had used for tenant meetings. The wood-paneled walls held framed photos of the building's original construction in 1962 and its renovation under Dorothy's ownership in 2004. Derek spread glossy presentation materials across the table, while his attorney arranged legal documents with practiced efficiency. "First," Derek began, "let me say how impressed we are with your mother's business acumen. This location is prime for what we're envisioning, and her maintenance of the property has been impeccable. He turned to a rendered sketch of a modern mixed-use development. What we're proposing is a complete transformation of this block. High-end retail, luxury apartments, structured parking, the kind of project that elevates the entire area. Calvin studied the drawings without expression as Derek detailed the offer. Market value plus 15% for the property, a 5% equity stake in the development LLC, and first right of refusal on future projects. The numbers were designed to sound generous to someone who had just inherited an unexpected asset. "Any questions?" Derek asked, settling back with the satisfied air of a man who had just laid out an irrefutable proposition. "Several," Calvin said quietly. "Your LLC filing shows 3 primary funding sources for Phase 1. What's your contingency if either of the secondary investors withdraws?" Derek's smile flickered slightly. Morton shifted in his chair. "The neighboring property's current zoning allows 3 stories maximum," Calvin continued. "Your renderings show 5. What's your timeline for variance approval?" "We have excellent relationships with the Planning Commission," Derek said, but his tone had lost some of its polish. "And the environmental impact study for the underground parking structure, has that been completed? Given the water table issues this close to the river?" Morton was now openly staring at Calvin. These were not the questions of a grieving son looking to liquidate an inherited property. These were the questions of someone who had spent weeks analyzing their entire proposal. "I should mention," Calvin said, his voice still conversational, "that I filed a formal zoning objection 3 weeks ago. As an adjacent property owner, I have standing to challenge any variance requests. The objection is procedurally clean." Beverly made sure of that. Derek's face tightened. "That can be addressed?" "The hearing won't be scheduled for at least 6 months," Calvin continued. "My mother's tenants, who have valid leases through the next 18 months, are very interested in attending. They've already contacted the neighborhood association." The conference room went quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Derek's careful facade was cracking around the edges. "There's no reason we can't work this out," Derek said, trying to recapture his earlier smoothness. "Everything's negotiable." Calvin stood. "Here's what I want." He placed both hands flat on the table, looking directly at Derek. "Your LLC withdraws its entire development proposal, in writing, filed with the city within 30 days. I withdraw my objection, and we never have this conversation again." "That's not," Derek started. "You came to my mother's funeral," Calvin cut in, his voice unchanged but carrying a weight that filled the room. "You sat in the front row. You took pictures of her estate attorney's contact information before she was in the ground. I don't want your money, Derek. I want you gone from Macon. Decide." Morton leaned over and whispered something to Derek. Calvin caught fragments. "Significant delays," and "strong position." Derek stared at Calvin for a long moment, seeing for the first time what he should have seen at the funeral. Not a grieving son to be managed, but a man who had been waiting quietly for exactly this moment. "Fine," Derek said finally. "Morton will draft the withdrawal. Beverly will review it before filing," Calvin replied. No hands were shaken. Calvin and Beverly gathered their materials and walked out together into the late afternoon sun, leaving Derek and Morton sitting in Dorothy's conference room, surrounded by their useless presentations and carefully crafted proposals. The November morning sun filtered through Beverly Trout's office windows as she handed Calvin the city's official acknowledgement of Derek's development proposal withdrawal. The single sheet of paper represented 30 days of careful legal maneuvering, but its message was simple. Derek Ashford's LLC had formally abandoned all plans for the Macon block. "Clean and complete," Beverly said, settling back in her chair. "No conditions, no reservations. They're gone." Calvin nodded, reading the document carefully. His mother had taught him to verify everything himself, even when working with people he trusted. The withdrawal was exactly what they'd demanded. unconditional and irrevocable. His phone buzzed, a text from Troy. "You need to see this." Attached was a screenshot of a business news alert. Derek's LLC had just lost 2 major funding commitments for their Q3 development pipeline. The Macon project had been positioned as the cornerstone of a larger regional expansion strategy. Without it, the whole structure was wobbling. "Looks like Mr. Ashford didn't have a backup plan," Beverly observed, reading the alert over Calvin's shoulder. Before Calvin could respond, his phone lit up with Raina's name. He let it ring through to voicemail. 3 minutes later, she called again. And again. On the 4th call, he answered. "How dare you?" Raina's voice was sharp with fury. "You had no right." "To do what?" Calvin asked quietly. "You know exactly what. $60,000, Calvin. My investment in that project is gone because I made decisions about my mother's property," he finished, his tone unchanged. "I'm sorry your investment didn't work out." "Don't patronize me," she snapped. "How did you even know about the deal? Have you been watching me?" Calvin said nothing. "Answer me." "I don't owe you explanations anymore, Raina." He kept his voice level. "Good luck with your next investment." He ended the call as she was starting another demand. Beverly raised an eyebrow. "That sounded pleasant," she said. "It was necessary," Calvin replied. He looked down at the withdrawal notice again. "What's next?" Beverly smiled and pulled out another folder. "Actually, I have someone I'd like you to meet. Lakeisha Wilson. She runs Savory Soul Catering. They've outgrown their current kitchen space, and they're looking for something exactly like what we have. She's built her business from scratch over 6 years, has excellent financials, and she's exactly the kind of tenant your mother would have appreciated." Calvin opened the folder, reviewing Lakeisha's business plan and financial statements. The numbers were solid. More than that, the progression showed the kind of patient, disciplined growth his mother had always respected. "She needs more square footage than our current configuration," Beverly continued. "But if we renovate the east wing, nothing structural, just updated equipment and better flow, we could accommodate her operation and actually increase the property's value. The money market account your mother left would more than cover it." Calvin studied the proposed lease terms. The monthly income would jump from $6,400 to $8,900, with annual escalators built in. But it wasn't just about the numbers. This was the kind of business his mother had always wanted to support. Black-owned, woman-led, built on work rather than connections. "Let's meet," he said. The meeting happened that afternoon. Lakeisha arrived prepared with sample menus, press coverage, and clear plans for expansion. By the end of the week, they had terms both sides felt good about. Calvin authorized the renovation from the money market account, and Beverly's contractor began work immediately. 2 weeks later, Calvin stood in the newly renovated East Wing, running his hand along the fresh paint. The updated kitchen equipment gleamed under new LED lighting. The floor plan flowed exactly as Lakeisha had envisioned it. Through the windows, he could see the parking lot his mother had repaved every 5 years without fail. He walked slowly through the space, seeing it the way Dorothy must have when she first bought it. Not just as a building, but as a foundation. Something built quietly, meant to last. Each decision she'd made, from the initial purchase to the maintenance schedule to the tenant mix, had been about sustainability rather than flash. Calvin stopped at the window, watching the late afternoon light play across the brick exterior. His mother had understood something fundamental about power. It didn't need to announce itself. It simply needed to endure. The call from Patricia came on a Tuesday afternoon. Calvin was reviewing structural plans at his office when his phone lit up with her name. "You need to hear this," Patricia said without preamble. "Raina's been making calls. Aunt Marie, Cousin Sharon, half the church circle. Anyone who might listen. She's spinning this whole story about how you froze her out after the divorce. Wouldn't let her be there for you during Mama's passing." Calvin set down his pen. What exactly is she saying? That you blocked her from properly grieving Mama. That the way you handled the estate was cold and suspicious. She's trying to get ahead of people doing the math, Calvin. She knows everyone knows about the inheritance now, and she's building this whole victim narrative before anyone can think too hard about what really happened. Calvin looked at his watch. 3:45 p.m. Text me her address. What are you going to do? Have a conversation. You want me to come with you? No. This needs to be just us. The drive to Raina's Buckhead apartment took 40 minutes in afternoon traffic. Calvin spent it in complete silence, the black binder sitting on his passenger seat like a loaded weapon. He hadn't opened it since finding it in his mother's closet. He hadn't needed to. Every document, every note, every piece of evidence was already burned into his memory. Raina's building had controlled access, but someone was leaving as Calvin arrived, and he caught the door before it closed. The elevator ride to the 6th floor gave him time to center himself. His mother's voice came to him. Dignity is demonstrated, not declared. He knocked on apartment 612. When Raina opened the door, surprise flickered across her face before she could control it. She hadn't expected this. Him showing up unannounced, standing quietly in her doorway. For a moment, he saw her recalculating, trying to find the angle that would let her manage whatever was about to happen. Can I come in? Calvin asked. I think we should talk. She hesitated, then stepped aside. The apartment was smaller than their old house, but still carefully decorated. Raina's taste had always run to appearances. Calvin sat down on her leather sofa, placing the black binder on the glass coffee table between them. What's that? Raina asked, taking the chair opposite him. Everything, Calvin said simply. He opened the binder to the first tab. My mother kept records, Raina, of everything, starting in the 2nd year of our marriage. When you first started asking her about her finances, Raina's face tightened slightly. She documented every conversation where you probed about property, about her will. She had help getting bank statements, I'm guessing from Pat, though she never said. And she had this. He turned to a printed email. From you to your friend Karen. His mama has nothing. This was a miscalculation. Calvin, I'm not finished, he said quietly. She knew you met Derek 2 years before you filed for divorce. She knew about the affair before I did. And she knew exactly why Derek came to her funeral. It wasn't about grief or support. It was about the Macon property his development needed. He looked directly at her. I knew about the affair too, by the way. Before the divorce, I said nothing and used it as leverage during settlement negotiations, just like I knew exactly what I was doing when I told Derek to walk away from Macon. Your investment loss wasn't bad luck. It was a consequence. Raina started to speak. Calvin held up his hand. My mother cleaned other people's houses her entire life. She watched, she learned. She built something worth $2.3 million without ever announcing it. And you sat in the front row of her funeral thinking she was nothing. He closed the binder. I'm not here for an apology. I don't want one. I'm here to tell you that I'm done. Not angry done. Done. And I'm telling you to your face, because you should know that what happened to your investment, what's happening to Derek's reputation in this city, none of it is an accident. It's all a result. Calvin stood, picking up the binder. Stop calling my family. Whatever story you're trying to tell, stop telling it. Because if it continues, I will have conversations of my own. With people who were at that funeral. With people who saw what Derek photographed. I have been patient. Don't test how long I can stay that way. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped through without looking back. The click of it closing behind him was very soft. The elevator arrived empty. Calvin rode down 6 floors in silence, the binder tucked under his arm, his mother's lesson complete. Power moves quiet. The morning sun warmed Calvin's coffee mug as he sat on the small porch of his mother's Macon house. His house now, though he still thought of it as hers. It was early October, 14 months since the funeral, and the air had that particular Georgia crispness that made everything feel cleaner somehow. From down the block, he could hear the bustle of Saturday morning prep work at Jasmine's Kitchen, the catering business that had taken over the commercial space, the sound of delivery trucks backing up, kitchen staff calling out to each other, the metallic clang of sheet pans being unloaded. It was the noise of something growing, something his mother would have appreciated. Calvin took another sip of coffee, letting the familiar creaks of the porch swing remind him of Sunday afternoons watching Dorothy work in her garden. That garden was still there, though he'd simplified it some, kept the roses she loved, added some easier care plants that could handle his every other weekend attention. The yard wasn't quite what it had been under her care, but it was loved. That felt important. His phone buzzed. A text from Patricia, with a photo of her eldest, Tamara, moved into her dorm room at Spelman College. The first disbursement from Dorothy's Education Trust had come through right on schedule last month. In the picture, Tamara was beaming, surrounded by new bedding and command-stripped photos on cinderblock walls. She had Dorothy's smile. Calvin texted back a quick heart emoji, something he'd never done before the past year, and set his phone down. The morning paper lay folded beside him, and he'd been avoiding the business section. Not because it bothered him, but because he'd read enough about Derek Ashford's financial restructuring when the story first broke 8 months ago. The Atlanta Business Chronicle hadn't devoted much space to it, just a brief piece about overextended assets and under-liquidated holdings, the kind of dry financial reporting that masked the human cost of ambition meeting reality. Derek's LLC had filed for reorganization after the Macon withdrawal triggered a cascade of investor pullbacks. Sometimes a single broken piece could collapse an entire structure. Calvin knew that better than most. It was literally his job. Beverly's assistant had seen Raina at Marcel in Westside Provisions last week, dining alone. She'd looked tired, the assistant said, though she'd maintained the careful appearance she'd always prioritized. Calvin hadn't asked for this information. It had simply arrived, the way information tended to in small southern cities, where everyone knew someone who knew someone else. He hadn't heard from Raina directly since that day in her apartment. Neither had Patricia, or any of the aunts, uncles, or church friends she'd been calling before his visit. The story she'd been crafting had died quietly, like a fire running out of oxygen. The sound of tires on gravel announced Troy's arrival. Calvin watched his cousin navigate the familiar driveway, parking in the same spot he'd used since they were teenagers, sneaking Dorothy's car out for late-night crystal runs. "You eating out here?" Troy called as he climbed out, carrying what looked like a paper bag from the barbecue place on Cotton Avenue. "Where else?" Calvin gestured to the porch table. His mother's table, solid oak, weathered by 40 years of Sunday dinners and Wednesday Bible studies. They settled in with their food, the familiar rhythm of family lunch falling into place. Troy had brought Brunswick stew and cornbread, still hot. Calvin provided cold sweet tea in Dorothy's mason jars. "You know what I was thinking about this morning?" Troy asked between bites. "What's that?" "That binder. You ever going to tell me everything that was in there?" Calvin considered the question, stirring his stew. "Most of it. But not all of it? Some things need to stay quiet." Troy nodded, understanding. "She was something else, wasn't she?" "Aunt Dorothy?" "Yeah," Calvin said softly. "She was." He looked out past the porch railing to the garden she'd tended so carefully for 4 decades. The roses were having a second bloom, deep red against the aging fence. Beyond them lay the vegetable beds where she'd grown collards and tomatoes, the fig tree she'd nursed through 3 transplants, the patch of land she'd worked while watching the neighbors' wealth flow past her front gate. She'd cleaned their homes, observed their habits, noted how they moved their money, and all the while she'd been building something of her own, not just the trust or the property, but a complete understanding of what was coming and what Calvin would need to handle it. The binder hadn't just been evidence. It had been preparation, protection, a way to ensure her son could face what was coming without losing himself to anger or bitterness. She'd seen everything, documented everything, and waited for the moment when he would need to know. Calvin folded his hands on the oak table, feeling the warmth of the morning sun and the depth of the quiet his mother had protected her entire life. He wasn't angry. He wasn't waiting for anything. He was, for the first time in years, exactly where he was supposed to be. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.